Welcome to Missions Life, where we share resources and encouragement for current missionaries, future missionaries, and those praying for missionaries. Missions can be hard, and we want to help you face the challenges of life, leadership, and ministry. We want your life to bear fruit for the gospel wherever you are. I'm Kyle Ferran, here with my co-host and wife, Heather. Welcome to the Missions Life podcast. Today on the podcast, we're joined by Elizabeth Vahey-Smith. And we had Elizabeth on the podcast last year sometime, and it was, I think, our third episode talking about TCKs, or Third Culture Kids. And we've invited Elizabeth back because she recently wrote a book called Trauma-Informed Leadership, which is a book that combines about a decade of leadership experience with her expertise as a certified trauma-informed care practitioner. And she equips leaders to identify and address the subtle, everyday traumas that can quietly undermine team trust and effectiveness. So her leadership background includes ministry and missions work, as well as her current role as COO of TCK Training, which is a training company recognized for its commitment to emotional safety in the workplace. And as an international speaker and full-time traveler, Elizabeth brings a globally informed perspective to the practical strategies she offers to missions leaders and teams looking to strengthen their team dynamics. So, Elizabeth, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Very good.
So this book just came out, right?
Yes, it came out in January.
Oh, that's exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's been a huge milestone that I'm really excited to have this resource available for people. I know I wish I had it 10 years ago.
Well, Elizabeth, when people hear the word trauma, they often think of major crises or life-threatening events. Could you explain maybe what small traumas are and why they matter, especially as we talk about in the mission setting?
Yeah. So when we're thinking about big T traumas, which people are often thinking about those major life events, these are huge crises and they have this continuing effect. Maybe people have nightmares or have phobias or have things that come out of that make a ton of sense because there's this huge, awful thing that happened. These smaller traumas, these are things that have happened and they have that same continuing emotional impact. We now have this fear or this anxiety or this concern that was born out of that initial event. And it may seem a lot smaller, like, does that really count as trauma at all? But by the fact that they are still being impacted by it moving forward into the future, that's what makes it trauma. And that's also what makes it really, really sneaky because these things are so small, we can often dismiss them as not being important. And then what we see happen is that these fears or phobias or anxieties that come out of this are allowed to persist instead of being met with trauma healing.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate you explaining that. Could you maybe share some examples of these small T traumas that missions leaders or team members or missionaries might experience? I mean, a lot of times without even realizing it.
Yeah. So some of these things could be even from before working in the workplace. They can come out of childhood experiences. So I've worked with some people who, when they were a child, their household was put on their shoulders. Like it was their responsibility to run the household and make sure their siblings were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And if they weren't, they, as the oldest child, would get in trouble for that. And so what we see then in adulthood is this anxiety around everyone needing to do what they're supposed to do. And the fear that comes up is if you don't do what you're supposed to do, I'm going to get in trouble. And so sometimes on teams, we can see people who are micromanaging other people or constantly looking over their shoulder. And of course, that's not super fun to be interacting with on the team, but it could be coming out of a trauma like this. Or something else that we see is when kids have been praised a lot for their accomplishments, sometimes kids can take away this idea that I am valued because of the things that I achieve. And what that looks like in adulthood can be this constant need for achievement in order to prove value, as if value isn't present unless they have achieved these things according to their metrics. And so we can kind of see this relentless drive, even when it's not helpful or it's not necessary or it's not considerate of the other people on the team. And it's born out of this hard childhood experience that's taught us these things, these life lessons that we've never scrutinized because it didn't seem like that big of a deal when it happened, except now it's still impacting us in the workplace.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about any small T traumas that might be going on just on team settings or that people are experiencing then as an adult in the mission field?
Yeah, absolutely. Those happen too. A lot of different traumas happen in the workplace, especially. One example of this is job security threats. I've worked with people who had people say things or do things that just made them wonder, uh, is my job secure? Am I in trouble? Like those kinds of questions pop up. And maybe like once isn't super problematic, but if they've had several of these experiences that kind of send off alarms in their brain, that can make them feel like my job isn't secure. And then what we often see are they're making actions to try to secure their job in order to feel like I'm an essential part of this and I am very important and I should keep my job. And that when it's motivated out of fear can look harmful. It can look like a negative impact on our teams. And so that's one example that we see as workplace trauma.
Mm.
And so, what happens when these different traumas go unnoticed, unrecognized? They go on for years, and how does that impact teams and the individuals?
Right. When it is left to go without being checked, these things can show up in some of the ways that we've already talked about. So, micromanaging happening because someone's worried that if you mess up, it's going to reflect on me poorly. And what I've often seen on teams is that there's a bit of trauma bumping almost. And so um, if somebody in their experience has been told that they are a constant screw up, they constantly make mistakes. Sometimes what we see as that trauma response is an arguing back with that voice in their head. And so they could have this internal wrestling, one voice saying, you're a constant screw up, and the other voice saying, no, I'm not, I didn't do anything wrong. And so if you get somebody who has this fear of you're going to make a mistake and that's going to reflect on me, telling them that they did something wrong, then we're going to see these little team explosions happening where one person's trauma bumped into another person's trauma, and now they're both having a really escalated response. And so, a part of the work that can be done is beginning to notice these things, beginning to notice, when am I feeling anxiety in the workplace? When am I feeling fear in the workplace? When am I feeling elevated? And is there a reason that that feels so hard for me when I'm faced with those triggers?
Hmm.
Yeah, so you kind of answered right into our next question. Like, what should teams be on the lookout for then? How can they know when there's trauma that's impacting their dynamics?
One of the things that is really kind of a key clue is friction. So, any points of tension there where one person is grating on another person in a way that does seem to indicate something bigger is happening than what we're currently looking at. Any kind of disproportionate responses could be an indicator of something deeper, and often that can be trauma history background.
Don't we kind of sometimes just gloss this over with saying, oh, well, they're just a gruff person, or oh, they lose their temper a lot, or oh, that's just how Joe is. Thankfully, I don't know any Joes. But, we have a way that we kind of explain this, explain it away. But how do we sometimes like parse out the difference between, just a sinful heart attitude and or it being a trauma response?
Yeah. I talk about this in my book, this difference between what's personality and what is a trauma response. And what I have seen is that all personalities have the ability to show up in community, in the workplace, on teams in healthy ways. And if something is looking unhealthy, if something's causing friction and dissonance and dissension, then probably there is something that needs trauma healing that's happening there. And I know that there can be people who want to double down on things that are sowing dissension in the team. But oftentimes, when we've looked into why people are behaving like that, there is something that happened in their history that taught them that that was how they should behave in those situations. Whether it protects them, whether it makes them feel safe, whether it makes them feel strong in situations that made them feel weak. Now, that's not the God glorifying way to respond to that, but that is what trauma has taught them as that strategy to move forward. And so when we can recognize that even when people are behaving in ways that are not glorifying to God, oftentimes that is because they're not feeling safe and they want to feel safe. We can really move forward with compassion, and that moving forward with compassion can help establish safety in a way where people can feel comfortable to risk doing things that feel vulnerable. When normally they would like to feel gruff because their trauma history maybe taught them that being vulnerable was dangerous and they would be humiliated if they did that. That maybe here, maybe in this space, maybe on this team, they can risk being vulnerable because they're going to feel heard rather than shut down. And I've seen huge transformations happen when we lead out of that compassion.
Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
It sounds like when there's a hair trigger on little things that blow up. That's often a indicator. It sounds like. Um,
Absolutely.
a helpful question from some of my coaching classes that was kind of along these lines is just that idea of what's behind that emotion. And so when there
Mm,
is this emotional like blow up, or just even internally, if we have sharp rise in our emotions, to be able to ask that question, like what's behind that emotion? Like why am I responding in that way? Or why is this other person responding in this way? What's behind that? What belief, what value, what identity is being threatened? What's behind that? And has been really helpful to remember that there are things behind our responses, and sometimes they can be something we've learned or some value or belief or identity that's threatened in there. So very good. Well, how do these subtle experiences shape the way teams function or interact and trust each other?
yeah. When these things are going to come up on our team, they often look like those frictions. They often encounter each other in trauma bumping experiences. And so when this happens, and when your trauma bumps into my trauma, that that creates a lot of distrust, especially when we don't understand where it's coming from. When I am not recognizing, there must be something behind that as you were talking about, that what's behind that emotion. If I'm not thinking on that level, then I'm just going to perceive the behavior as a threat to me. And that is going to make me feel threatened and not trust you. And so when we see this happen on our teams, when we don't have language to be able to talk through these things, often we see what starts as friction end up as distrust and eventually dissension on teams.
Yeah, and that is not a fun workspace at all to be in. I think it just kind of keeps spiraling, right? It's hard to pull out of that. We work with a lot of team leaders, and so what are some just practical ways that team leaders can be recognizing this, and maybe what's the first step to addressing this?
I think that step one is curiosity-led conversations.
Hmm.
And so if we are seeing those big emotions, to start asking really great questions. Oftentimes, leaders operate from this assumption that they know what's going on. It's their job to know what's going on. So we assume that we are good at our jobs. And oftentimes, there is more information that we could learn if we started by asking questions. And so sometimes we come into spaces and we think that we know why there's an elevated response, but asking those questions about what's going on for you, what do you think might be behind that? Tell me more about how this situation went down. What was your side of the story? More information is going to empower us as leaders to make wiser decisions in ways that strengthen the psychological safety of the space.
Mhm.
Because oftentimes, when elevated responses are happening, it's because people don't feel safe. And one way to quickly help them feel safe is by letting them feel heard. And so, hearing their side of the story, understanding very deeply where they're coming from before we move forward onto whatever next steps we need to have in our conversation.
Hmm. Do you happen to have a list of those questions in your book?
I do. I do. I
Oh,
have a
that's
list of
great.
great questions for you. Yeah, they're all in
I
there.
bet. But you're so right. As soon as someone takes that posture, that listening posture, their whole body language changes and you yourself can just relax with
Yeah,
someone who's taken a posture of listening. I've had that happen in my own life. I've tried to at times remember to step into that space and watch it kind of soften the person across from me's response. It's amazing how powerful good questions and good listening skills can be in those kind of tense critical situations.
absolutely. Absolutely. It's a game changer.
Mm.
Could you share one or two of those questions that would be helpful for our listeners, just as a example of those questions to help that
Like,
process?
what would be your go-to top 2 or 3 questions? If let me just maybe set a stage. Like, there's a team meeting that happened, and there was maybe a hyper elevated response to a situation, and the team leader's like, I have no idea why that person responded aggressively or negatively or something.
Yeah. So if I'm sitting in them in a one-on-one after the fact, then one of the first questions I would ask was, so what did you think? How did that meeting go for you? And just really starting at that preliminary space is going to help them not feel accused. They haven't been accused of anything. They don't know whose side I'm on. Maybe I agree with them. They don't know. But they're going to tell me everything that they saw from that experience. And what I could learn is that they felt really attacked by something that someone said or did that maybe I noticed or maybe I didn't. Right. And so just setting that stage of asking, so how did that meeting go for you? Can elicit so much really helpful information that helps me move forward accordingly. I think another conversation starter I could ask in that situation would be asking what was triggering for them. If I've already established the use of that language, and in my organization we're really comfortable using that. If I was in an organization that didn't have that language, I could ask something along the lines of, I noticed you got really elevated when this question was asked. What was going on there in that moment for you? And then really targeting that to see what was behind that emotion there.
No, that's
Yeah,
helpful.
we've used that one before. Just I noticed this was a little bit of there was some tension there. Can you help me understand that? And it opens a conversation of you've identified the issue. It puts it on the table of, hey, we're not going to just let this slide because behaviors we can't act like that as a teams and continue to function well. So there's that accountability factor, but needing to open up the space to be able to listen first, and then be able to address that. There's that balance there as leaders of, um, wanting to give people space and understand, but at the same time, not allowing destructive behaviors to continue on that are damaging the teams. So that is always a balance there, and oftentimes there is some things that can be discussed to help people grow in that, but also to change and change the behavior as well. Are there some common leadership mistakes that unintentionally leaders may do to reinforce some of these traumas instead of healing them?
Yeah, yeah. I think most things that leaders do that are harmful are unintentional, right? I think all of us as leaders are trying to do well in our roles. And so there's so much unintentional things that do happen. One of those is that sometimes when we see elevated responses, it can feel a little bit like insubordination. It can feel a little bit like this is a problem that needs to be controlled. And so we can, as leaders, try to exert our authority over the elevated emotions. And the issue is when people are having an elevated emotion, and that means that they're not feeling safe for whatever reason, something has made them feel unsafe. And so they're having these big emotions to try to make themselves feel safe again. When we move in with the force of our authority, that feels like an attack. And it affirms what the brain is saying, that yes, you are unsafe. Yes, this was dangerous. This is exactly what you feared that it was. And so, if we as leaders can take a deep breath and recognize elevated emotions are a sign that they feel scared right now. They feel like they are in danger, and we can do something to help reestablish their sense of safety. That is going to drastically de-escalate the situation. Just as you were talking about, Heather, that like when people feel heard, that visible relax of their tension in that situation, that's what we want to achieve. And by exerting our authority, usually we escalate rather than achieve that transformative sigh of relief.
No, that's really helpful. So, what are some ways that leaders could establish psychological safety?
It starts with those curiosity led conversations. It starts with letting people feel heard. And I think then it moves into collaborative conversations. And so, yes, now I've heard what you have to say. And yes, we may have some expectations for how behaviors are going to happen in our workplace. But then thinking through the collaboration of, given that you have this trigger here, given that this thing makes you feel afraid, and so you're acting out in these ways, and given that we need this kind of behavior to keep a safe space in our workplace for everyone, what do you need in order to succeed? What can that look like? What reasonable accommodations can we provide you so that you have the ability to succeed in the workplace, even with this fear, but also meeting this expectation that I have? How can we do both? And
What are some of the
involve,
things that, sorry, what are some of the things that people might mention that they need, or that is helpful to them? What are some things that you've come across?
yeah. So I had one person who felt extremely triggered whenever there was a question that she didn't know the answer to. Presumably, previously, she would get in trouble for not knowing the answer to something. And so if I asked her a question that she didn't know the answer to, instead of saying, I don't know, she would get extremely upset. And that is challenging in the workspace when we need to be able to ask questions. And so we talked through this, and I said, so what do you need from me? Like, how can I support you if this is something that's triggering for you? And she said that if I rephrased my questions to ask, do you know where the bathroom is? That would be easier to say no to than if I just asked her, where is the bathroom? And she had to say, I don't know. And so those like subtle, tiny things that I can easily change the way that I'm asking questions much more easily than she is capable of going and healing the trauma history that has resulted in this particular quirk that she has. And so, really coming in and recognizing what are little things that I can do that can quickly get us back on the same page so that we can succeed in the workplace. And thinking about this in the terms of efficiency. I had some people who responded very sensitively to feedback. And I said, how am I supposed to lead you if you don't receive my feedback well? And they said, this is how I need feedback. And they gave me a very specific formula. I needed to first start with something that they had done well. I needed to second, not say anything that they had done wrong. Just tell them what I wanted them to do moving forward in the future. And this was my little formula. And I've met a lot of people. I've told this story many times, and people are like, this is absurd that you would need to do this for them. And maybe, but also it was easy enough, and they started receiving my feedback so much better, and we started getting things done so much faster, and we didn't have this huge explosion where they were feeling all of the big feelings. We could just get back to work. And in fact, this formula was so easy, I started using it with just everybody on my team in general, and I've had a lot less problems with other people exploding. And so it does sometimes feel like unnecessary. And also, what recommend leaders to look for are those small things that, whether they're not necessary or not, they're reasonable pivots to make that can get your team back on track. And that is what helps teams thrive, especially when team members see their leaders making these accommodations and they feel so loved and valued because of these pivots that we're making.
I think that's exactly what came to my mind, that extending compassion. You know, when you extend an accommodation or when you extend a way that you as a leader could pivot, it means you really heard them
Yeah.
and you value the relationship and you want to make that right. And does it help, you know, after a while of providing these accommodations that it might help the person lessen that trigger or maybe eventually be able to handle a different conversation? Or, you know, I think there has to be a starting place for a change of responses. Like we can't just a lot of times just change what might be a habit or a response for, you know, decades out of our life. There has to be some sort of starting point.
Yeah, a lot of
Yes.
times our triggers or whatever they are, whatever things trigger us, it brings up all those emotions that we had from all those past experiences. Even though your feedback was good feedback, it was linked to all that
Mm.
junk that had happened before. So yes, it was a fine way to do it, but because of their past history, how they'd gotten feedback in the past, all of that junk the emotions came up and was linked to your new feedback, and so that causes a lot of issues that way. As you look at how people are responding in a team context, though, so someone responds poorly, their responses are now creating traumas for the rest of the team. How do you confront that issue and be like, I realize that this is difficult for you, but your responses are now causing traumas for other people. How do you work with that? Help them to see that that's what's happening.
Yeah. I've found that open and honest communication about that a lot of people are really receptive to that, especially when you've laid the foundation of this trauma informed knowledge for your team. So when your team does have this understanding because you've taught them about how our words matter, how these things impact others, how that can be carried forward, they start to become cognizant first of the things that have happened to them that have impacted them, and then they become cognizant of how they're impacting other people around them. And so when I've drawn that connection of this thing that you did has kind of affected the psychological safety of the space for the team, And in these ways, a lot of people are really receptive to that. And so then it is a strategy of, okay, so knowing that this is your trigger and knowing that this is the expectation, what reasonable accommodation do you need in order to be able to meet the expectation, even navigating around your trigger? And I think that that goes really well. The other thing that comes to mind for that question, though, is that just because an experience that could be experienced as traumatic happens doesn't mean that it will be experienced as traumatic. And one thing that we can do for our teams is to have great conversations around what's happened, to have peer support come alongside of them, and to also think about what are their key takeaways. Because often what's experienced as trauma are these lessons that we have believed to be true without thinking about them, without scrutinizing them. They've slipped into our subconscious and we just assume that this thing is true and we move forward with that. In order to ferret out those sneaky narratives before they imprint themselves on our subconscious, having good conversations about the incident that occurred can help us notice those things and correct those narratives before we internalize them. And so when we as leaders have noticed those things having happened, to debrief the person or the whole team and have really open and honest conversations about it, it can help avoid trauma.
That's good. Anything else leaders can do to help create that safe environment for team members to process and address those, especially addressing those subtle traumas when they're coming up?
I think one major thing is modeling. It can be really vulnerable to talk about trauma history background, but if we have leaders who are modeling this behavior, and what that can look like are people saying, I, as a leader, am feeling a little bit triggered right now. Here's why I'm feeling triggered in this way. And so I want to handle that by taking a couple minutes and breathing through that, or asking for some clarification because while my brain is telling me that what you mean is that it's all my fault, I'm pretty sure that's not what you're actually saying. Could you clarify your intentions there? And so this vulnerability in leadership can model as well as train our teams and how they're allowed to show up in the workplace. And we can make some of these conversations a little bit more run of the mill. And I think that that education really transforms teams.
Yeah, that's helpful. What's one mindset shift you wish every missions leader would make when it comes to team health and resilience?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm gonna join them with a semicolon because I kind of have to. They go really closely together though. It's this idea that everyone is doing the best that they can, and it's my job to mobilize. Oftentimes when we're on teams, leaders can get this impression that people are being intentionally difficult on their team, like maybe they're doing this on purpose, or they are doubling down in this sinful attitude. And so we get the idea that they could be doing better, and we come at it from this position of, what's the matter with you? But when we believe that everyone is doing the best that they can, just like we're doing the best that we can, then we come at it from this approach of, what do you need? What do you need in order to be doing better? If you're doing it the best that you can right now, how can I mobilize you to achieve something greater? And when we recognize our responsibility as leaders to mobilize our team, then we become very invested in helping them succeed in that way. And so, whether it's more training, whether it's more support, whether it is getting networked with trauma healing resources, these are ways that we can come alongside of our team, give them reasonable accommodations, and set them up for success in the workplace.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And we can maintain an expectation for workplace behaviors even as people are going through trauma healing. And maybe some of that looks like reasonable accommodation, but as you guys have already mentioned, we do have to have a certain standard before it starts impacting the safety of the other team members. It is tricky to balance that.
Yeah.
What's one piece of advice you just give personally to a leader that might be trying to walk this road?
Personally, if I'm sitting down with somebody, I really want to help them think about what are ways that they're being triggered in their leadership journey. What are the personal things that are coming up for them? What are the hard parts for them? And what's behind those emotions? What's making those things feel so hard? Because we as leaders have just as much, if not more, trauma than the people on our teams under us. And so doing that work is really important for us, and it's going to empower us to show up in emotionally healthy ways if we've already done the emotional processing work that we need to do for ourselves.
Mm.
There was a helpful saying for those of us guys out there that don't really identify clearly with emotions. The reason they're called feelings is because you feel it in your body.
Mm.
And that was just a helpful phrase for me because, yeah, you get elevated heart rate, you get whatever, and just identifying that, okay, if I'm feeling something physically, there's probably an emotional response going on there. Take some time to figure out what that is. And so it's always been a helpful little phrase for me to remember that. So
I love that.
as people encounter different things. Um, what are any other resources that you have that would be helpful for people kind of taking the next step to dive a bit deeper into this and to look into how they can be learning more?
Yeah, absolutely. I, of course, have the book, Trauma Informed Leadership. That's a fantastic resource. It goes so much deeper into all of the different things that we've talked about here. I also do leadership coaching and have a program that I run leaders through to help them recognize these things and start applying that into their workplace. And then I also have for people who have experienced some workplace trauma or have noticed that they are in harmful patterns, I have workplace trauma debriefs. And so that really helps people to process their experiences, especially with a mind of how is this showing up in the workplace and affecting my team moving forward. So those are a few different resources I have to offer.
Great.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, we'll link those there in the show notes. So something else that came to mind was that you kind of touched on a little bit there, but just the idea of the importance of teams creating a kind of some guidelines of standard of behavior. Our region went through that a few years back, and it's been very, very helpful just to have clarity on what can we expect from each other. What do we expect the behaviors and attitudes to be like as we work together as a team? Because without that, there's no standard of accountability. There's nothing to be able to call into question. It was just really, really fuzzy. And so having that has been very helpful for our teams to be able to know, okay, this has happened, and then it creates an opportunity for discussion to happen much sooner than when it's happened like 8 times, and then it's like, okay, we don't know how to have the conversations, and so it makes things get addressed much sooner than if we didn't have that. So I should encourage teams to be able to have a clarity on that, take some time to create something, find something that would work for that, to be able to help them have that clarity.
Well, I know this was just a teaser, literally a taste of all that's in your book. And so I hope people will dive into the information that you've learned and are so willing to share to everybody, and that it will be a help to teams. Because we've all been on really great teams, that you feel like you can get all the work done. And we've also been on teams that we wish we had healthier interactions on. And this conversation has really given us some ways to maybe view those interactions differently and to pray over our responses and the way we want to continue to move towards good interactions on our teams. And, just the personal relationships as brothers and sisters in Christ, and the ways that we can be helping and building each other up. So thank you for the time. I appreciate this conversation all the way from Vietnam, right?
Yes, yes. And thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun to be able to share this with you guys and with your listeners too.
Yeah, it's been a real joy to have you on. So we pray that the book will be a blessing to many people, and even just this podcast, just listening to it, giving some good suggestions and tips on that as well. So thank you very much. Well, that's all for this show, and we want to thank you again for spending your valuable time with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider taking just a moment and giving us a great review. Your review will help people find the podcast and allow these resources to encourage more people. If you took something valuable away from this episode, please share it with someone who would enjoy it.
If you'd like to find the show notes, blog posts, and free resources for ministry and leadership, as well as some information on my book, Overflowing, visit kylefarran.com. That's KYLEFARRAN.com. Hope to see you soon on a future podcast.